Well, thank you everyone for being here today. We will go ahead and get started since we're at the top of the hour here. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining Churches for Middle East Peace for this webinar, Raising Your Voice for Peace in Israel-Palestine, Best Practices for Advocacy. My name is Jennifer Madrant. I'm the Outreach Manager at Churches for Middle East Peace. And I'll say just a couple words about CMEP here before we get started. Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP, is a coalition of more than 30 national church communions and organizations who works together to organize U.S. policies that actively promote a comprehensive resolution to conflicts in the Middle East with a focus on Israel and Palestine. And so this webinar today, we really hope that it might be a resource for advocacy. We are hosting this conversation specifically leading up to the Advocacy Summit in person in Washington, D.C. that Churches for Middle East Peace is hosting next month from April 20th to 21st. And we really hope that you might consider joining us to advocate and raise your voice together on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. But if you can't join us for that, we hope that this might still be a helpful resource for you to advocate from wherever you're located and to do so effectively. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Hassan El-Tayyab is FCNL's Legislative Director for Middle East Policy. His passion for foreign affairs is rooted in his desire to make life better for people in the Middle East, including his extended family in Jordan. He is convinced that advancing a more peaceful and diplomacy-based foreign policy in the Middle East is critical, not only for the family he loves, but for peace and stability worldwide. His writings and commentaries have been featured in numerous news outlets, including CNN, BBC, World News, and many others. Hassan, it's great to have you with us here today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
So the way that we're going to structure this conversation today is it'll really be a conversation between Hassan and I'll ask him a few questions to get us started from the perspective of everyone here. So I'll ask in the first person, how might I, best advocate and engage in advocacy related to Israel-Palestine? We'll pause about halfway through to open it up for questions and allow everyone to ask some questions directly to Hassan. You can use the Q&A function or post directly in the chat, and then we'll pick up the conversation again and again leave some time for Q&A at the end. So to get us started, Hassan, I just want to kind of open it up with a pretty basic question, but I think it might be helpful for many of us. What are the basics that I should know before I begin to engage in congressional advocacy? What should I know before I start the process? And how do I get that going?
Well, thank you so much for having me on this call and having this conversation. I think the first most basic thing that everybody should know is that your members of Congress represent you and should be meeting with you if you request a visit. That is bottom line. You can request a visit on their website. You can call up the main office. You can try to be connected right to the DC staffer that works on the issue. You could speak to the, somebody in the regional office. But bottom line, your member of Congress represents you, and you have a right to be heard. You and folks in your community that really care, especially about Israel-Palestine. It's so important that people, make these arrangements, make these meetings, with their members of Congress and their staff, and have that conversation. I'll also say, even if you can't talk to the member of Congress, talking to the staffer can sometimes be even more strategic because they're the ones that are writing the policy memo for the boss. They're the ones that, that are going to be handling that subject area that you're requesting about. So, they're both super important. So how do you start the process? Again, it could be as simple as going on the website, filling in the form, scheduling your visit, or making a phone call to the DC office and requesting to speak directly with the person that handles, in this case, Israel-Palestine, the foreign affairs staffer, or the military LA or legislative assistant. A lot of times offices have, State Department fellows that are also handling these different portfolios. So you might be speaking with someone that's not a full-time staffer at the office, a permanent staffer, I should say, but someone that, is working on that for the member. Also, I would say is, be gracious too. Do your homework, do your research, figure out where your member of Congress stands on any given issue. Be grateful for, things that they've done that you like, right? And part of that's, doing that research and then expressing that gratitude because, members of Congress, they're like anybody else. They like to be thanked. They like to be, maybe even more so than some others. So I would start off with those two basic tips. Again, knowing that you have a right to be heard, but also, doing your homework and trying to make sure that you know who your member of Congress is, where they've been on this issue, and also potentially what committees and caucuses that they're on currently that could be effective, and strategic for your issue area. If we're dealing with a member that's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, that's really important for Israel-Palestine issues. Better yet, if they're on the Middle East Subcommittee of HVAC or the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they are a priority target. So just knowing that can be super helpful in the meeting.
Thanks, Hassan. That's so helpful. And I think a really helpful kind of framing for, what we're going to dive into a little bit. But I'll just say anecdotally, when I first, set up a meeting, had my first meeting, with my congressman, with my senator, I was really nervous. And once I started to do a little bit of that research, I think it eased a lot of the nerves for me, knowing, oh, okay, now I have an understanding of some of the issues, right, that this person stands behind, some of the committees that they serve on. And like you're saying, that can really help you shape how you might approach your meeting with them. So that being said, what are some tips that you might have for us in terms of how I might have an effective meeting with my representative's office? What else should I do to prepare when I'm going into that meeting? Is there any particular language I should use? How do I kind of be strategic in my planning here?
Well, the good thing about everyone on this call is that they are connected to Churches for Middle East Peace, who has an incredible lobby team in Washington, D.C. under the leadership of Kyle, and who has all this relevant information, these great lobby asks. So you're already ahead of the game having all of these resources. If you're not part of the CMEP network, you should definitely be a part of the network and get all the resources and the action alerts that they send out. And some of the messaging that is going to be really effective has been vetted through expert DC policy staff at CMEP already. And FCNL and CMEP, we collaborate a lot. So that's a great place to start. The other thing I would mention is take a look at FCNL's lobby visit roadmap. I shared a link with Jennifer earlier, and this is FCNL's guide to have a really successful lobby visit, especially if it's in a larger group. It can still apply if it's just you requesting the meeting, but it goes through about first off, starting, what's your thank you, right? Okay, Representative Betty McCollum, thank you so much for leading last Congress on HR 2590, the No Way to Treat a Child legislation to prohibit U.S. military funding to go to annexation, to go to home demolition or child detention in the West Bank. We think that's really critical. And what we'd like for you to do now is reintroduce another version of that bill in this Congress, right? I had my thank you, it was very clear. And then I had my ask, right? That was just for Betty McCollum. Other members, you might have a different ask, but that's just an example. Okay, so you've got that first part of the meeting out of the way. The next part I think is really crucial, is tell your story. Why do you care about this issue? What connects you to it? Do you have a connection through your faith? Or have you traveled to the region? Or do you know someone that's traveled to the region? These stories, it doesn't have to be an exact personal experience, but show your connection to it. And that's going to really make an emotional impact on your member of Congress or the staffer working on the issue. And once you've done that, then give the meeting a little bit of space to breathe. Let the member or the staffer respond. Where are they at? Hey, we're on board with that ask. We're totally going to co-sponsor. Or, hey, we're not ready yet. We have a couple other things to consider, and they might respond with some points that you may not have heard before. And it's good to have that exchange and take real close note of where their pushback might be. And then think about that, because then you can follow up later and try to continue the conversation. Once they've had their opportunity to respond, you can reiterate the ask. You could also respond to what they said, and then try to set up a follow-up meeting. Okay, so it sounds like you need a couple weeks to sort of vet the legislation, or take a look at the letter, or take a look at the policy. Who's the best person for me to reach out to when I'm going to follow up with you? Okay. So that to me makes for a really great arc of a lobby visit. If you do that, you're going to probably have a tighter lobby visit than most of the people or most of the constituents they talk to, because a lot of people they come in and they approach these meetings. A lot of people only approach their member of Congress when they're angry about something. So if you'll stand out if you approach it in this way, where you're trying to be constructive, have a dialogue, and really connect personally to the issue. And of course, treat it like you're building a long-term relationship. This isn't a one and done. I think change, especially change on Israel-Palestine, is not going to happen in one lobby visit. This is going to happen after years of sustained advocacy, and that relationship you're building with that staffer. Who knows? They might be the chief of staff someday. They might be a member of Congress someday. So it's important to build those great relationships.
Yeah, thanks, Hassan. I especially want to highlight what you said just now about tone and about long-term relationship, of like the tone in which we use, right, when we go into these meetings is so crucial and can kind of make or break how what we share is received. And that just approaching, right, whoever we're meeting with kindness, with patience, and with respect can go, so far, and can make all the difference, rather than, coming with anger or aggression. And then again, just want to highlight that what you're talking about, of we're trying to build a relationship, right? You're trying to build a relationship with whatever office you're meeting with, because you don't know where any of those individuals will be in the future. And you want to be able to get another meeting with them, to come back to follow up on previous conversations you had, and things like that. I wanted to ask a follow-up question here, and it kind of goes hand in hand with a question that we got from someone who's on the call. And the question is, what do we do when we know that our member of Congress has a very different viewpoint on Israel-Palestine than we do? Is there a way to overcome that barrier, and really make our advocacy efforts worthwhile? And so this person also asked, when we feel like we're in somewhat of a David versus Goliath situation, when there are, kind of large Christian Zionist organizations such as AIPAC that seem to have a lot of control in areas like this, or especially in our particular area, how can we kind of counteract that?
That's a really great question, and I think it dovetails with the last piece. Build a relationship with them. That's going to matter, and you don't know when you're going to have that breakthrough moment. I know some folks in the FCNL network. They've consistently been, speaking truth to power, bearing witness on Israel-Palestine, and talking about the moral reasons why we need to have accountability, human rights, and self-determination for Palestinians. Years and years go by, and then finally they have a breakthrough with that member of Congress. Now, this is obviously just a hard situation, right? There are other groups in your district that are lobbying the opposite way. They might have also a close relationship with your member. There might be money involved. That's another piece. Some of these decisions are made, like even before they get sworn in, by who supports their campaign, and that can be very difficult. One thing, but arguments and persuasive lobbying still really matters. And I've seen people make progress just over time. One example I think I can mention is Rep. Deutsch. He was the former Middle East Subcommittee Chairman on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Very powerful position. Very pro APAC, if you want to put him in that box, and has left to do work for I forget the actual name of the organization he's working on, but it's more supporting Israeli issues in the U.S. and other Jewish issues, and really not someone that has done a lot in support of Palestinian human rights on Capitol Hill. But a couple of years ago, I actually worked with his office pretty effectively to try to end the blockade on Yemen. And we got Rep. Deutsch to say things like, we need to, lift restrictions on movement and access. We need to, lift the blockade as a humanitarian act and decouple it from the really, contentious politics. This should just be a humanitarian issue. And the light bulb went off in my head as we're getting him to, write that letter, work with other members on HVAC, to think, well, there's a real Gaza tie-in, right? And so that was an opportunity for me to actually communicate, hey, once we finish this letter, there are other places in the world where all of this is happening, and we have real restrictions on movement and access that are, preventing people from getting, medical treatment, that are preventing from people from getting education abroad and just having a normal life in Gaza. So I use that as a launch point. So sometimes if you're, again, it gets back to that research piece, someone that is not with us on, Palestinian human rights in the way we think, he should, but I was able to use the Yemen blockade letter to actually talk about some issues around Gaza that were really effective. And that turned into some follow-up meetings with their staff, which turned into them engaging a State Department on some ways to potentially open up movement and access. Not where we need to be. I'm not trying to say that this is, this was a massive breakthrough, but this is a game of inches too. And I thought we did make some progress with Rep. Deutsch's office in that particular meeting. Now, again, hang in there. I know it's hard. Now, if you're really stuck, the other way to do is start building power locally. And your voice matters, but your voice plus other voices matters, exponentially more, when you can get more folks in your community to engage. Because ultimately, what are members of Congress motivated by? They want to keep their job. And so if they know that there are a lot of community members, other faith leaders, business owners, other maybe local elected officials, people that are doing different, activities for the community, if you can get all those folks to agree on certain issues, it makes it a little harder to ignore that perspective in the district. So that's another way, I think, is continuing to, sharpen your advocacy skills, but also sharpen the advocacy skills of your community.
Thanks. Those are a couple of really encouraging pieces of advice, which I take to heart as well. As a constituent in the state of Ohio, those are helpful leresources for me as well. But even just thinking about, how we build power in numbers, and especially, leveraging those, the voices and power of other people in our community, especially those that might be faith leaders or kind of have other roles like you shared.
Jennifer, if I may, I wanted to say one more thing on this point. Being strategic on, knowing who your member of Congress is, and, there might be some asks, like supporting the Betty McCollum bill might not be a good ask for your member. I think you should still ask that member to support it, even if you know for sure they're not going to jump on. But when maybe we can get into this a bit later, but especially if there's this U.S. tie, that's why I feel like some of the Shireen Abu Akleh advocacy is so important because Shireen, she was killed in Palestine in Jenin last year, but she was a U.S. citizen, so there's a real tie. And her family, she actually lived in New Jersey. So we've worked with worked with Senator Menendez, Senator Booker, and tried to continue to highlight what's happening in Palestine, using Shireen as an example, but trying to make this broader case. So sometimes really figuring out who your member is. They might not always be good on Israel-Palestine issues, but if there's this local tie-in, with Jamal Khashoggi, Representative Connolly, and Senator Tim Kaine, they did a ton of work in the Senate around Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by Saudi Arabia for speaking out. Obviously it was a tragic and gruesome murder that happened, but these members, did a ton of work on it because he was he was a resident in the state of Virginia. And we're having some effective advocacy going on in New Jersey right now around Shireen, that I think just being aware of those local connections can be super helpful.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. And I know that there's been similar kind of traction in the state of Washington, and I know of some constituents who are a part of CMEP's network that have worked together with the family of Rachel Corrie, who was an American activist who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer in Palestine, a number of years ago. But the kind of that local tie and connection can still be a really big impetus and a starting point for storytelling. And I know that that's been effective for them as well. So I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah. Let's open it up now for questions. If folks have questions for Hassan, kind of based on where the conversation has gone thus far, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. And even if they're questions that are very specific to your region, we would welcome those as well. And maybe while we're waiting for those questions to come in, maybe Hassan, I'll just pose another one to you here. Can you say something about maybe the difference between meeting in person and meeting virtually, and what the benefits of one or both of them might be at this time?
Yeah, meeting in person is probably the most effective way to build a relationship with your member of Congress or their congressional office, and to make a persuasive argument that might flip them. I cannot tell you enough how important it is for that in-person connection, if you can have it. God bless Zoom. We're having this conversation on Zoom right now, and we're getting a lot out of it. But really, that in-person meeting is wonderful. And if you can have that, even with an in-district staffer, you build that relationship. Just found that people get back to you quicker if you do your follow-up. Your emotional argument can land more. If you're making that personal case of why the issue connects to you. And I just think it's a fantastic way to really make advocacy more effective. So if you can, I think that's great. Although if Zoom is your only option, or on the phone is your option, I think that's great too.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Obviously there are so many benefits of being able to meet virtually, but even just kind of coming back to this piece of wanting to build a relationship and the power that in-person meetings can have, it's a really helpful reminder. And I'll use that just as another plug and mention CMEP's upcoming Advocacy Summit in Washington, D.C. It's a 2-day summit. The first day, we will hear from prominent Palestinian Christian leaders from the region, in, kind of sharing about the realities on the ground, sharing some of their stories. And then we'll also hear from some experts on Capitol Hill, I think, including Hassan as one of those speakers. And then the second day of the summit will be, you'll have the opportunity to meet in person with your representatives, with your senators and their offices on Capitol Hill. And so those kind of opportunities and experiences are really invaluable when it comes to kind of the larger scheme of relationship building and working on these issues.
And in-person meetings, speaking of which, that's fantastic that you have so many folks coming to DC and doing this advocacy. I'll just tell a brief story. I did an in-person lobby visit with Senator Risch, who at the time was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This was under Trump, the Trump administration. And I was there with several constituents. And this isn't recorded, right? No, I'm just kidding. I know it is. There were several constituents, and immediately Senator Risch was like, appreciate you, Hassan, but we'd like to hear from the Idaho constituents. Didn't stop me from continuing to try to push. We were trying to get him to co-sponsor a bill to end U.S. military participation in the Saudi war in Yemen. And I was saying something, he was ducking, he was dodging. It was a very heady conversation. And one of the constituents from Idaho just said, with all due respect, Senator, I just don't want my taxpayer dollars going to support another civil war in the Middle East. And he looks at her and he says, well, I can't argue with that. It really just changed the whole course of the meeting. And so, but that was, again, all the knowledge I have, all the background, all that academic stuff, you don't have to be an expert. A lot of this stuff isn't rocket science. This is about supporting human rights. This is about enforcing U.S. law and not getting involved in human rights violations in the Middle East or anywhere for that matter. And sometimes those really simple remarks from constituents are the most powerful things to influence a member of Congress's thinking. And doing that in person, I cannot say enough how important that is.
That's such a great story. And I think it kind of distills this idea that constituents, have power, and we have a right to raise our voices. And that ultimately, our representatives do want to hear that, and oftentimes might agree with us on some of those most basic issues, right? I don't want to fund another civil war in the Middle East. I don't want my taxpayer dollars to go towards human rights abuses, right? When it comes down to, kind of a simple, ethic or stance as that can often be something that a lot of folks can agree on, right? When we take out, like you're saying, some of the other political issues at play. So as someone who often does not bring the in-depth, professional political analysis into the conversation, I appreciate that story because it reminds me, of some of the strengths that I can bring to those conversations. Yeah. So there's a question in the chat here, and it says, 2 of my 3 members of Congress, my representative and a senator, are Jewish. Can you speak generally about any considerations that might be helpful to keep in mind when approaching these members about the situation for Palestinians and in Israel-Palestine generally?
Well, one is empathy. Anti-Semitism is real. It's not good, and it's something that we need to be sensitive to. And I think, having that consideration is going to go a long way to build the long-term relationship with that member, build mutual respect, build trust, let them know that you care about the safety of Jewish Americans and Jews anywhere. And that's super important, right? It doesn't mean, we care less about other folks. It doesn't mean you should care less about Palestinians or anybody. But I think, really understanding that this is not okay. And anti-Semitism is definitely on the rise in a lot of places. So that's one. Um, Two, I think sometimes I scratch my head and say, well, some of the things that we're actually advocating for here would create, a more stable Israel as well. Like Palestinian human rights and Israeli national security, to me, are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other. Like truly, if you care about Israeli national security, you want to figure out a way to protect Palestinian human rights. You want to figure out a way to get, put everyone on a path towards a sustainable solution that creates self-determination for all peoples here. So I think that's another important point to make, that we're not picking one side over the other. Right now, we're trying to make sure that, one, U.S. law is adhered to. And right now, an occupation that never ends is against U.S. law. It's against international law. Supporting, giving the Israeli military, $3.8 billion of weapons a year, and then they use that military assistance to assassinate Shireen Abu Akleh. That is not going to create a safe Israel or a safe Palestine. So we need to get down to basics. And I think the campaign to support Palestinian human rights, does support Israeli national security. And another thing I would say, there is a reality on the Hill where, there are some members that lead initiatives, and it's pretty strategic. And the fact that they can speak on, as a Jewish member of Congress, we've gotten Senator Sanders to lead a lot of initiatives. I think that's very powerful, and it gives other people more the ability to be bolder. We've got other members that have been very outspoken, like Rep. Sarah Jacobs from California. She's been fantastic. Rep. Schakowsky. So working with those members and other groups like J Street, I think can be very helpful as well. In trying to connect with other, advocates in your community, whether it's Jewish Voice for Peace, Americans for Peace Now, or J Street, or other folks that are thinking, they might not agree on everything. And I know they actually disagree on some stuff, but, trying to figure out who are the stakeholders in your community. And maybe you could be the bridge builder to get folks to actually work together on this issue. And we need that more than ever right now.
Thank you. Such a great answer, and a good reminder too, to be thinking out who do we want to build coalitions with in this work, and how can we strengthen our work together, and especially, by, building some of those relationships across various faiths, and really being in conversation and following the lead of some Jewish communities who are leading on this work, and especially the cause for Palestinian human rights. I think that's a good kind of transition point now for us to pivot. And I want to ask you about what the current kind of relevant issues and legislation are on the table that we might want to focus on, when we do set up meetings. Are there specific issues or pieces of legislation that we can center those conversations around?
Yeah, so this is another important question. It's still a bit early. I just want to caveat everything I'm saying. It's a bit early in the legislative session. It just started in January, where people are still getting ready to introduce new legislation. Like, we don't have a new Betty McCollum bill, for instance. So we're still waiting for that to get introduced. One thing you could ask is that, we know Representative McCollum is planning to reintroduce her No Way to Treat a Child legislation. We'd like you to be an original co-sponsor. Or Rep. Carson is planning, and I know this for a fact, in May to reintroduce the Justice for Shireen Act to require the State Department to do a human rights report on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, and to determine who is responsible and if U.S. weapons were used. That opens up a lot of doors for more follow-up action to try to get accountability. And so we want as many co-sponsors on that new bill as possible. Again, because it's not introduced, we don't have a bill number yet, but we know it's coming, so we can ask that folks reach out to Rep. Carson's office and become an original co-sponsor, or put out a statement saying why they want to jump on the Betty McCollum bill, or why they want to jump on the Justice for Shireen Act. So those, I think, are two really important asks for the House side. One more ask I think, for the House side. This is appropriation season. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. I'm looking out in the street. There are people walking up and down the street right now. I bet you about half of them are here because it's appropriation season and they want, money for different projects. And we need to make sure that UNRWA is funded. This is so important for Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank. Rep. Carson is actually leading a letter right now, and they are asking for a top line of $259 million for UNRWA. The last year is 225, but with inflation and with greater needs, they're asking for 259 million. So you could make that request of your House or even Senate members that we fully fund UNRWA, and that we support this Rep. Carson letter. Okay, so those are some good House asks. Maybe by the time the summit rolls around, we'll have some of these bills introduced, and there might be some other things going around. There are always letters going on. There's I think pretty soon there might be a new Jamal Bowman letter, calling on the Biden administration to take action with all the recent escalations in the West Bank. That could be something good to support. But on the Senate side, I wanted to flag, I'm going to back up a little bit and say that something else historic happened last week. Senator Murphy and Senator Lee, they introduced a resolution. Forgive me, I'm going to get a little wonky here for 1 second. 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. What is that? This is a rarely used provision in the Foreign Assistance Act that, takes a look at human rights violations by any given country. So they invoked 502B on Saudi Arabia because of their war in Yemen, their attacks on dissidents at home and abroad, their murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and you name it. There are obviously a lot of problems there with their behavior, and especially considering how much military aid they get from the United States. So the 502B process is like 2 steps. One step is you introduce the bill, and then it gives an automatic vote if you want it. And that vote, he's planning on pulling the trigger on a vote on this bill in probably the next couple weeks. And if they pass it, it requires the State Department to do a total human rights assessment on Saudi Arabia. So that's step one. Step two, once they get the report, then they have expedited procedures to force a vote to do resolutions that can go right to the floor. They don't need to go to Senate Foreign Relations Committee where a lot of bills go to die, unfortunately. It can go right on the floor, and they can use it to condition, restrict, or continue military aid to Saudi Arabia, or military funding. So they could cut off U.S. support for Saudi bombings in Yemen. They could make sure that no security forces can be used to kill journalists. Guess what? Opening up the door to 502B changes the game. Once this bill, if we get this report to happen, I would really like to have the grassroots make a push. Again, this is more of a Senate play because you don't have the same procedures in the House side. But again, if Senator Murphy and Lee are able to pull this off on 502B with Saudi, I think we should do a 502B resolution on Israel and look at their human rights record with regards to home demolitions, child detention, with regards to annexation, with regards to the blockade on Gaza, with regards to the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, and more. So my request for the Senate right now, granted, we could ask for companions to all the bills I mentioned in the House side, but we could also ask that they invoke 502B to get State Department to do a full human rights assessment of Israel, and so that could be a good ask as well.
Thanks. That was so much helpful information. And just want to reiterate what I hear you saying is that 502B, kind of has the ability to be used as a tool so that it's not just right specific to Saudi, but can be, opened up and potentially used as a tool for demanding human rights investigations in Israel or in a number of other contexts.
Exactly. So they're doing it on Saudi, but this is such a flexible tool. You could actually stack multiple countries together where you could look at any country that gets US assistance that has a habit of harming journalists in the line of duty. It's not just an Israeli problem. It's not just a Saudi problem, but it's also a Philippines problem, a Peru problem, an Egypt problem, a Mexico problem. And so you could potentially stack one of these things together and then do a global human rights standard or a global human rights report. And so I think given where we're at, early this year, after the new government got sworn in, I was on a webinar hosted by IMEU, and I just left that. I was just scratching my head. I said, we cannot do what we've always done and expect a different result. We need to try new things, especially on Israel-Palestine right now. Given how dire the situation is, we cannot go, back to the same members of Congress and ask that they just support these messaging bills. We need to support those, but let's move up the ladder of escalation. And 502B is one potential vehicle for that, because it forces the State Department, if you pass it, to do this human rights assessment, and also gives members of Congress the ability to force votes and debates on whether or not we should be restricting aid to prevent the assassination of more journalists, or again the whole host of issues that we've been discussing so far. So I think really at this stage of the game with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, considering the escalations we're seeing, considering the impunity we're seeing, we need to start thinking about new tactics. And I think 502B is a really important tool that we should think about.
I really appreciate your analysis there and your kind of honest reflection that we need to be trying new things at this point, in time. I want to just say to everyone who's listening, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat, as it relates to any of these issues that Hassan's been sharing about, or anything we've talked about previously, or even anything that hasn't come up yet. But I just want to emphasize kind of what you were just saying there, Hassan, about the ability to request investigations as it relates to journalists internationally. And I'm mentioning this because I've heard you speak on it before, not because it's my own original thought. But thinking back to the first part of this, of our conversation, and about all the potential angles that might find resonance with the offices that we meet with, I'm hearing here the potential for there to be an angle of just focusing on the protection of U.S. journalists abroad, and so then the issue is not Palestine or Israel really at all, but can be an angle of protecting U.S. journalists. Is that right?
Yeah, the Shireen Abu Akleh case, there's a new Guardian article about her. It kind of goes through the timeline. It's horrific. I mean, what happened to her, but then, what happened after at the funeral, what happened in other, pockets of Palestine and the West Bank, when people started learning. I will say I was in Palestine last year, when she was killed. I was there on a 3-week trip. I spent about a week with the Ramallah Friends School, and I woke up on May 11th, 2022, and was just horrified. And people were heartbroken. I mean, they're already going through so much. To say, Shireen Abu Akleh getting assassinated kind of means that no one's safe. If someone of that high profile can be targeted like that, people just felt really unsafe. They felt, devastated that this person that had been covering the occupation for decades was targeted in such a brutal way. And it really, granted, we haven't seen everything I want to see, but we saw more people in Congress speak out about that than I had seen, on almost any other violation of human rights, in the West Bank, up to that point. We saw Menendez speak out. We saw Mitt Romney speak out. We saw Senator Cardin speak out. We saw Representative Meeks, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee last year. Now he's the ranking member because Republicans have the House. But all in total, we saw about 100 members of Congress speak out. And now there's an active FBI investigation. Now, there is a citizen hook here, and that's really important. Just like there was a U.S. resident hook for Jamal Khashoggi. And, for me, I care about all people. I don't care where they're from, where their citizenship is, but we also are catering to an audience here on Capitol Hill. And if they want to take the ball and run with it, that's really important. And accountability for Shireen means accountability for anyone else that's wearing a press badge in Palestine. And that really matters. That matters if we're trying to learn more about the occupation. So I think it's absolutely critical. So as far as my, assessment here, we got the FBI investigation. That's going. We need more pressure on DOJ. So far, members of Congress, they can't really get an update. The DOJ says we can't confirm or deny if we're even, doing this investigation. But more people speaking out right now and addressing DOJ, I think is going to be helpful. So that's step one. Step two is the State Department report. They just did a human rights report yesterday. I think yesterday or the day before. I read the part about Shireen. Barely mentions Shireen, basically says, the Israeli assessment says that, it was unintentional. Other people might disagree. That was basically all they said, but that's not really a US-led investigation. We need a State Department investigation to see what happened, why did it happen, were US weapons used? Was that a US made sniper rifle? I mean, that's really important information. And then we have to make sure that it never happens again. So there's so much more to do. Again, reintroduction of the Justice for Shireen Act. I think every member of Congress should care that a US citizen was murdered in Palestine. That really matters, and it should matter to every member of Congress.
Thanks. That's really helpful to kind of hear you go through the thought process and thinking behind that in terms of how you're thinking, that it's an issue based on US citizenship. So we're getting down to the end of our time here. We have about a little over 10 minutes left, but there's a question in the chat here from someone who's present. The question is, do you have any thoughts or suggestions about an approach to addressing our member of Congress regarding the Nasser family and the Tent of Nations ongoing 30-year struggle to get their land registered? I know that, I'm not sure how much FCNL works with Tent of Nations. I know that, CMIP, has worked closely with them for some time. Is this something you feel like you might be able to speak to?
So I just want to make sure I don't really work on this too much. Is this in the South Hebron Hills area?
Yes.
So I believe I had lunch with Nasser and his family when I was out there. I went with Extend, and they made, I told him I was Jordanian. He's like, "Oh, welcome." It was kind of like a homecoming. They made me some amazing food, and he told me the story of his family and what his dad had to go through, and what his dad told him, and what he's now telling his children about this occupation and what's going on in Area C, which is just really tragic. Now, this, to me, I think deserves more congressional attention, and possibly, congressional letters. It might be a good place to start. Off the top of my head, I have not been tracking this issue probably as closely as I should, or as closely as CMEP has. But if there hasn't been a letter recently, that might be a good thing to do. And also, we've got a lot of members of Congress going to the West Bank, or going to Israel, and not always getting to everywhere they need to go in the West Bank. I went to visit Nasser on the Breaking the Silence tour. through the South Hebron Hills. I went to Hebron. I went also with Yehuda all over. We checked out all these different pieces of infrastructure in the West Bank, making sure members of Congress get out there and also get to sit and have, dinner, whether it's Nasser or any other families in Area C, and to see what their life is like, and to see the struggles they're going for. I will say that right after it wasn't at Nasser's house, but we went to, we went to another spot in South Hebron Hills, and 45 minutes after we left, settlers came and burned a bunch of crops for the family. So that was just horrifying to know that, one, I mean, we were in potential personal danger here, but also that the family and the folks that were just so gracious to us, making us food, making us tea, having a couple laughs, telling us about their lives, were then brutally attacked for no reason. That, to me, I think we need more members of Congress to see with their own eyes what's going on. So again, congressional letters, but getting members to actually take these congressional delegations and meet folks face to face and have to, explain what they're doing on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Sounds like I had a different Nasser. Definitely met a
Yes,
Nasser.
yeah,
but
I said yes too
Capitol Hill.
quickly when I heard South, and I was picturing Bethlehem in my mind. So it might have been a different Nasser. The Tent of Nations farm is just outside of Bethlehem. But I think what you shared still is very relevant and applies to the situation.
Yeah, forgive me. Yeah, so they have a house, like a small cave and farmhouse, kind of right outside the Hebron area, South Hebron Hills. There was a settlement, an outpost, probably like 300 yards away, and it's just what they've gone through is just insane. It's just so tragic, and anyway, so regardless, I think we need more members of Congress to get out and talk to these families that are suffering in Area C or under the occupation anywhere in the West Bank.
Yeah. And I was just looking for, I know that, CMEP will often, tie in the Nasser family case into public statements that we release or action alerts. And I couldn't find the exact one that I was looking for that was most recent, but, something else to bring to these meetings are some of those, statements, letters, and things like that from CMEP, from Friends of Tent of Nations, which is a US-based organization that closely follows and supports the Nasser family. Anytime that you can elevate, right, something that an organization has written that multiple religious leaders have signed on to, that it can only help to the story that you're telling, to say and look at all of these other communities and people who have the same concerns that I'm raising now. So those can also be helpful to bring into meetings. Any other questions that folks have that they'd like to pose here to Hassan? And Hassan, is there anything else that that we haven't gotten to yet? Anything that you want to share based on how our conversation has gone?
Well, I'm just so grateful for this time. I think going back to the 502B thing, right now, I think, our Palestine, solidarity movement in the United States is getting stronger, especially with things like the Black Lives Matter movement, and the response to the Israeli bombings in Gaza in 2021 in May. So people are starting to wake up and say, wow, this is injustice. This isn't right. And the US needs to change our approach to make sure that our taxpayer dollars, again, are not being used to perpetuate gross violations of human rights. We've been supporting, things like messaging bills, like the Betty McCollum bill. All of those things are really important and have gotten us to a place that we're at now. But we need to be starting to demand and expect more from our members of Congress at this point. And I think we need to start asking that they put bills on the House and Senate floor and actually force people to vote. 502B is one way we can do that through Foreign Assistance Act, but also if there are new weapon sales, we can use things like the Arms Export Control Act. Just know that your member has a lot of tools that they can use to actually get a robust vote and debate. And at this point, we need to actually have this conversation out in the open. And in the best, most powerful thing to do is get people to actually get on the record, not just with a messaging bill, not just with a letter, but actually voting yes or no. And I hope that, in the coming, months and years that we start, getting more proactive and less reactive, because otherwise I think we're just going to be in this hamster wheel. That's what I'm advocating for here, and I hope this presentation has given you all some thoughts and ideas about ways we can work together to engage Congress.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I am certainly encouraged, by what you've shared, by the, kind of the fresh and innovative approaches that you're taking in your work. And I'm certainly going to take some new ideas and new approaches into the next meetings that I have. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us and to share, with CMEP's network today. We know that this will probably be a resource for many in the months to come and in the weeks to come. So thank you. I'll say one last time that if you are considering joining CMEP for our upcoming Advocacy Summit, and you have questions or concerns, please reach out, info@cmep.org. We're happy to answer questions, but if, whether you're in the DC area or it would be a bit of a trip for you, we would really, really love to advocate together with you in DC. We're offering support to set up meetings, with offices on the Hill. So please do consider joining us. And if you don't join us, then maybe consider, kind of joining us virtually and setting up your own meetings, by Zoom or by phone from home, and checking in with us and letting us know when you've done that. So thank you again to Hassan. And thanks everyone for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.